Sarah Martinez had always known that military life would be challenging, but she never expected the real battle to begin before she even stepped foot on foreign soil. At 22, she stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with shoulders that seemed too narrow to carry the weight of the uniform she wore with such pride. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her brown eyes held a determination that many mistook for naivety. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton as Sarah made her way to the administrative building for her final briefing before deployment. She had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, graduating top of her class from West Point, excelling in every training exercise, and proving herself capable time and again. Yet as she walked past groups of seasoned soldiers, she could feel their eyes following her, hear the whispers that questioned whether someone like her belonged in their ranks. Colonel James Harrison was a man who commanded respect through intimidation. At 55, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with silver hair cropped short and eyes that seemed to cut through whatever they focused on. His chest was decorated with ribbons and medals earned through 30 years of military service, including 3 tours in combat zones. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, though many questioned where the line between tough and cruel actually lay. When Sarah entered his office that morning, Harrison barely looked up from the stack of papers on his desk. The room smelled of coffee and leather, with military memorabilia covering every available wall space. Photos of Harrison with various dignitaries and fellow officers created a shrine to his accomplished career. "So you're Martinez," he said without lifting his eyes. "The one they're sending to Afghanistan." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, standing at attention. Harrison finally looked up, his gaze traveling from her boots to the top of her head with obvious disapproval. "I've read your file. Impressive grades, clean record, recommendations from your instructors." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "On paper, you look like soldier material." The emphasis on paper was not lost on Sarah, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet, Martinez. Paper doesn't mean much when bullets start flying." Harrison stood and walked around his desk, circling her like a predator sizing up prey. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Sarah remained silent, knowing the question was rhetorical. "I see someone who's going to get real soldiers killed because she thinks she has something to prove." His voice was calm, almost conversational, which made his words cut deeper. "I see someone who's taking up space that should belong to a man who can actually handle the job." The words stung, but Sarah had heard variations of them before. She had learned to let them roll off her back, to use them as fuel rather than let them break her spirit. "With respect, sir, I believe my training record speaks for itself." Harrison laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "Training record? You mean shooting at targets that don't shoot back? Running obstacle courses designed by people who've never seen real combat?" He shook his head. "Martinez, the enemy doesn't care about your training record. They don't care that you can do push-ups or memorize military protocols. They care about whether you can carry a wounded soldier twice your size to safety while machine gun fire rips apart the ground around you." Sarah felt her jaw clench, but forced herself to remain professional. "I understand the challenges, sir. I'm prepared to face them." "Are you?" Harrison moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because when your convoy gets hit by an IED and your squad mate is bleeding out in the sand, crying for his mother, you're not going to have time to think about how this proves women can serve in combat. You're going to have to act, and if you freeze, if you hesitate for even a second, because you're not strong enough or tough enough, or just plain not ready, then good men die." The colonel walked back to his desk and sat down, dismissing her with his posture. "But hey, what do I know? I've only been doing this for 3 decades. I'm sure you and the politicians back in Washington know better than someone who's actually been there." Sarah struggled to find the right response. Part of her wanted to defend herself, to list every achievement that had led her to this moment. Another part wanted to walk out and prove him wrong through her actions rather than her words. Instead, she chose silence, understanding that anything she said would only provide more ammunition for his attacks. "Your deployment briefing is at 1400 hours, Harrison said, returning his attention to his paperwork. "Don't be late. Ann Martinez?" "Yes, sir." "When you come back broken. Don't say I didn't warn you." As Sarah left the colonel's office, she felt as though she were walking through thick fog. The hallway seemed longer than before, and every face she passed seemed to carry the same expression of doubt she had just encountered. She made her way to the women's locker room, needing a moment alone to process what had just happened. The reflection staring back at her from the mirror showed a young woman in uniform. But Sarah could see the uncertainty that Harrison's words had planted. She had always been smaller than her male counterparts, had always had to work twice as hard to prove herself worthy of the same opportunities. But until that morning, she had believed that her determination and skill would be enough. "You can't let him get in your head," she whispered to her reflection. "You've earned this." The rest of the day passed in a blur of briefings and equipment checks. Sarah threw herself into the preparation, memorizing every detail of her mission parameters and double-checking her gear. She had been assigned to a forward operating base in the Kandahar province, where she would serve as a communications specialist and liaison with local Afghan women. It was important work, the kind that could make a real difference in the lives of people who had known nothing but conflict for decades. That evening, Sarah called her parents from her barracks room. Her mother's voice carried the familiar mixture of pride and worry that had become routine since Sarah announced her intention to join the military. "How are you feeling about tomorrow, mija?" her mother asked. "Ready," Sarah replied, though the word felt hollow after her encounter with Harrison. "Your father and I are so proud of you. We know you're going to do amazing things over there." Sarah smiled despite herself. Her parents had immigrated from Mexico when she was 3 years old, working multiple jobs to provide opportunities they had never had. Her father cleaned office buildings at night and worked construction during the day. Her mother took care of other people's children while raising her own. They had sacrificed everything to give Sarah the chance to attend college and pursue her dreams. "I won't let you down," Sarah said, and she meant it. "You could never let us down, sweetheart. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise, Mama." After hanging up, Sarah sat on her narrow bunk and stared at the photo she kept on her nightstand. It showed her family at her graduation from West Point, all of them beaming with pride as she stood in her dress uniform. Her younger brother Miguel had joked that she looked like a toy soldier, but his eyes had been bright with admiration. The next morning arrived faster than Sarah had hoped. She joined her unit for final equipment checks and last-minute briefings. The other soldiers were a mix of seasoned veterans and first-time deployers like herself. But even among the newcomers, Sarah felt like an outsider. Conversations seemed to pause when she approached, and she caught more than one sideways glance directed her way. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man with kind eyes and graying temples, seemed to sense her isolation. He approached as she was securing her pack for the 100th time. "First deployment?" he asked. "Yes." "Sergeant, nervous?" Sarah considered lying but decided on honesty. "A little." Rodriguez nodded. "Good. Anyone who's not nervous is either lying or stupid, and both types get people killed." He paused, studying her face. "I've heard the talk, Martinez. Some people have opinions about women in combat zones." Sarah's stomach tightened. "Yes, Sergeant." "Here's what I know," Rodriguez continued. "I've served with men who were cowards and women who had more courage than entire platoons. Gender doesn't make you brave or smart or capable. Training does. Character does. You've got good training, and from what I've seen, you've got character too. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The words provided some comfort, But as their transport plane lifted off from the tarmac hours later, Sarah found herself thinking about Harrison's predictions. The colonel's voice echoed in her mind, questioning her strength, her readiness, her right to be there. She stared out the small window at the landscape shrinking below and wondered if she would return as the same person who had left, or if the experience would change her in ways she couldn't imagine. The flight to Afghanistan took nearly 18 hours, with stops for refueling and crew changes. Sarah spent most of the time reading intelligence reports about the region where she would be stationed, trying to memorize the names of local leaders and understand the complex political dynamics that shaped daily life there. The more she read, the more she understood that her mission would require not just military training, but cultural sensitivity and diplomatic skill. When they finally landed at Bagram Airfield, the heat hit Sarah like a physical force. Even through the air conditioning of the transport plane, she could feel the intensity of the Afghan sun. The landscape was unlike anything she had ever seen, harsh and beautiful, ancient and scarred by decades of conflict. As she gathered her gear and prepared to board the helicopter that would take her to her assigned base, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was about to begin the most important chapter of her life, a chapter that would test everything she thought she knew about herself. Colonel Harrison's words still echoed in her mind, but now they served a different purpose. Instead of undermining her confidence, they had become a challenge she was determined to meet. She would prove that her presence in Afghanistan was not a liability, but an asset. She would show that courage and capability had nothing to do with size or gender and everything to do with heart and determination. The helicopter's rotors began to spin, kicking up clouds of dust that stung her eyes and filled her lungs. As they lifted off into the Afghan sky, Sarah Martinez began the journey that would transform her from a soldier trying to prove herself into a warrior who would never again need to justify her place on any battlefield. Forward Operating Base. Scorpion sat like a scar on the Afghan landscape, surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire and watchtowers that never slept. Sarah had been stationed there for 3 months now, and the routine had become as familiar as breathing. Morning briefings, equipment maintenance, patrol preparations, and the constant vigilance that kept everyone alive in a place where danger could emerge from any shadow. The base housed about 200 soldiers, and Sarah had gradually found her place among them. Her role as communications specialist had proven more valuable than many had initially expected. She coordinated between different units, managed intelligence reports, and most importantly, served as liaison with the local Afghan women who provided crucial information about Taliban movements and activities. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been right about one thing. Her gender had become an asset in ways that the critics back home could never have anticipated. Afghan women would not speak to male soldiers about what they had seen, but they would talk to Sarah. Through these conversations, conducted in her improving Pashto and broken English, she had helped identify several IED locations and provided intelligence that had saved countless lives. But the work was taking its toll. Every morning brought new reports of violence, new evidence of the suffering that war inflicted on innocent people. Sarah had seen things that would have been unimaginable to her just months before. Children orphaned by suicide bombers, women widowed by roadside explosions, families torn apart by a conflict that seemed to have no end. The other soldiers had gradually accepted her presence, though she still felt the weight of constantly having to prove herself. Every mission was a test, every decision scrutinized more carefully than those of her male counterparts. She had learned to ignore the whispered comments and sideways glances, focusing instead on doing her job with the professionalism her training had instilled in her. Specialist Davis, a communications technician from Ohio, had become something of a friend. He was 24 years old, married with a baby daughter he had never met, and possessed a dry sense of humor that helped everyone get through the difficult days. He and Sarah often worked late into the night, monitoring radio transmissions, and updating intelligence reports. "You ever wonder what we're really accomplishing here?" Davis asked one evening as they reviewed the day's intercepts. Sarah looked up from her computer screen. The question was one that haunted many soldiers, though few voiced it openly. "Every day," she admitted. "I mean, we clear out one Taliban cell and 2 more pop up. We build a school and they blow it up. Sometimes it feels like we're trying to empty the ocean with a bucket." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But then I think about the women I talk to, the ones who tell me where the bombs are hidden because they don't want their children walking into death. Those conversations matter. Those lives we save matter." Davis nodded slowly. "You're probably right. I just hope it's enough." The conversation was interrupted by the sharp crack of incoming mortar fire. Both soldiers hit the ground as the base's alarm system screamed to life. The attack was brief but intense, lasting about 10 minutes before the enemy melted back into the darkness. No one was seriously injured, but the incident served as a reminder that safety was always temporary in this place. 2 weeks later, Sarah's unit received orders for a mission that would test everything she had learned. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban target was hiding in a compound about 20 kilometers from the base. The mission would involve a nighttime helicopter insertion, followed by a search and capture operation that could last several hours. Captain Williams, the unit commander, briefed the team on the operation's details. The target was believed to be responsible for multiple attacks on coalition forces and had been evading capture for over a year. The compound was located in a village where Taliban sympathizers were known to operate, meaning that the team could expect resistance. "Martinez," Captain Williams said as the briefing concluded, "you'll be with the search team. Your language skills might come in handy if we encounter civilians." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This would be her first major combat operation, the kind of mission that separated soldiers from warriors. As she prepared her equipment that night, she thought about Colonel Harrison's words. In a few hours, she would have the chance to prove whether his predictions were accurate. The helicopter ride to the target zone was tense and silent. Sarah sat between Davis and Corporal Johnson, a veteran of 3 previous deployments who had seen more combat than most soldiers twice his age. The aircraft flew low to avoid detection, following valleys and ridgelines that hid them from enemy observation. 5 minutes out," the pilot announced through their headsets. Sarah checked her weapon one last time and reviewed the mission parameters in her mind. The team would fast rope down into a field about half a kilometer from the target compound, then move on foot through the darkness. Speed and stealth would be crucial to the mission's success. The helicopter hovered over the landing zone, and one by one the soldiers rappelled down into the Afghan night. Sarah's boots hit the ground with a solid thump, and she immediately moved to her assigned position in the formation. The air was cool and dry, filled with the sense of dust and distant cooking fires. The approach to the compound took 40 minutes of careful movement through rocky terrain and scattered vegetation. Sarah found herself focused entirely on the present moment, each step, each breath, each shadow that might hide a threat. The training that had seemed so artificial back at Fort Braxton now felt vital and real. When they reached the outer wall of the compound, Captain Williams signaled for the team to take their positions. Sarah was assigned to cover the rear entrance while the main assault team breached the front door. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady as she raised her weapon and scanned her assigned sector. The breach came exactly at midnight. Flashbang grenades lit up the compound like artificial lightning, followed immediately by shouted commands in both English and Pashto. Sarah heard movement behind the rear door she was watching and tensed, ready to respond to whatever emerged. Instead of armed fighters, she found herself facing a young Afghan woman holding a terrified child. The woman was perhaps 18 years old, wearing a traditional blue dress that was torn and dirty. The child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 3, was crying and clinging to his mother's leg. "Don't shoot," the woman said in broken English. "Please, no shoot." Sarah lowered her weapon and approached slowly, keeping her voice calm and gentle. In her limited Pashto, she told the woman that she was safe, that no one would hurt her or her child. The woman seemed surprised to hear her own language from an American soldier, especially a female one. Through careful questioning, Sarah learned that the woman was the target's sister-in-law, forced to live in the compound as essentially a servant. She had seen nothing of the military activities that her husband's brother conducted, but she knew where he kept his weapons and documents. While the main search team combed through the compound's primary buildings, Sarah stayed with the woman and child, gradually earning their trust and extracting valuable intelligence. The target himself had fled the compound several hours earlier, but the documents and equipment they found would prove crucial in tracking his movements and dismantling his network. The mission was considered a success, even without capturing the primary target. As the team prepared for extraction, Captain Williams approached Sarah. "Good work tonight, Martinez. Your handling of those civilians was textbook perfect." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but more importantly, she felt a sense of belonging that had been missing since her arrival. She had performed under pressure, made crucial decisions in a life-or-death situation, and contributed to the mission's success in ways that went beyond her specific military training. The helicopter ride back to base was markedly different from the outbound trip. There was still tension, but it was mixed with the satisfaction of a job well done. Sarah found herself replaying the night's events, analyzing her performance and identifying areas for improvement. Back at Forward Operating Base Scorpion, the debriefing session lasted until dawn. Intelligence specialists pored over the documents and electronic devices recovered from the compound, while Sarah provided detailed accounts of her conversations with the Afghan woman. The information would be processed and shared with other units, potentially preventing future attacks and saving lives. As the sun rose over the Afghan mountains, Sarah finally made her way to her bunk for a few hours of sleep. She was exhausted but exhilarated, feeling for the first time since her deployment began that she truly belonged in this place. The doubts that Colonel Harrison had planted in her mind seemed smaller now, overshadowed by the evidence of her own capabilities. The weeks that followed brought more missions, more opportunities to prove herself, and gradually, more acceptance from her fellow soldiers. Sarah found herself taking on additional responsibilities, leading small teams on intelligence-gathering operations and serving as the primary liaison with local women's groups. One afternoon, while updating intelligence reports, she received an email from her family. Her brother Miguel had been accepted to college on a full scholarship, and her parents were bursting with pride. As Sarah read about her family's joy and achievements, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She was not just fighting for abstract concepts like freedom and democracy. She was fighting to preserve the opportunities that allowed families like hers to pursue their dreams. But Afghanistan had not finished testing her yet. The country was preparing to reveal just how brutal war could be, and Sarah would soon face challenges that would push her to the very limits of her physical and emotional endurance. The skills she had developed and the confidence she had gained would prove crucial in the trials that lay ahead. That evening, as she sat cleaning her weapon and preparing for another patrol, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed since leaving Colonel Harrison's office. She was no longer the uncertain young soldier seeking validation. She had become a warrior who knew her worth and understood her place in the larger mission. The transformation was not complete, however. The most difficult test still lay ahead, one that would leave scars both visible and hidden, and would ultimately bring her face to face with Colonel Harrison under circumstances neither of them could have imagined. The war was about to show Sarah Martinez what true courage really meant, and whether she possessed the strength to survive not just the enemy's attacks, but the aftermath of surviving them. The explosion came without warning on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah was riding in the second vehicle of a 3-truck convoy heading to a village meeting with local women leaders when the world disappeared in a flash of orange fire and deafening noise. The improvised explosive device had been buried in the road for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. When consciousness returned, Sarah found herself hanging upside down in the twisted wreckage of the armored vehicle. Blood was running down her face from somewhere she couldn't identify, and her left arm hung at an angle that made her stomach lurch. The smell of burning fuel and metal filled her nostrils, mixed with something else she didn't want to identify. "Davis!" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. "Rodriguez!" The silence that answered was more terrifying than any explosion. Sarah tried to move, but pain shot through her entire body like electricity. She could hear voices outside the vehicle, angry voices speaking in Pashto, getting closer. Through sheer force of will, Sarah managed to work her right hand free and reach for her sidearm. Her training took over, even as her vision blurred and her head pounded. She had to stay conscious. She had to survive. The Taliban fighters who approached the wreckage expected to find dead Americans, easy targets for their propaganda videos. What they found instead was a wounded soldier who emptied an entire magazine in their direction before they could react. Sarah's shots weren't accurate. Her vision was too blurred and her hand too unsteady. But they were enough to make the attackers retreat and reconsider their approach. The firefight that followed lasted nearly an hour. Sarah, trapped in the overturned vehicle, held off multiple attempts by Taliban fighters to reach the convoy while American reinforcements fought their way through roadblocks and ambush sites to reach the scene. Every movement sent waves of agony through her broken body, but she maintained her position and continued to return fire whenever targets presented themselves. When the rescue team finally reached the convoy, they found a scene of devastating destruction. The first and third vehicles had been damaged but remained upright, with casualties but no fatalities. The second vehicle, Sarah's vehicle, had taken the brunt of the explosion and rolled down a steep embankment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was unconscious but alive, with severe concussion and multiple fractures. Specialist Davis had not been so fortunate. He had died instantly when the IED detonated, never knowing what hit him. Sarah was conscious but trapped, her left arm clearly broken and her face covered in blood from multiple cuts. "Martinez, can you hear me?" shouted Sergeant First Class Thompson as he rappelled down to the wreckage. "I'm here," Sarah managed to say. "Rodriguez is hurt bad. Davis is—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The extraction took 2 hours. Sarah's left arm was pinned by twisted metal, and every attempt to free her caused excruciating pain. Finally, using hydraulic tools brought by helicopter, the rescue team managed to create enough space to pull her from the wreckage. The helicopter ride to the field hospital was a blur of pain and medical personnel working frantically to stabilize her condition. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes hearing the voices of the medical team, sometimes hearing nothing but the rhythmic beat of rotor blades cutting through Afghan air. At the field hospital, doctors worked for 6 hours to repair the damage to Sarah's left arm. The explosion had shattered both bones in her forearm and severed several tendons. Shrapnel had peppered the left side of her face and neck, requiring dozens of stitches to close. A piece of metal had missed her left eye by less than an inch, leaving a scar that would run from her temple to her jaw. When Sarah finally woke up 3 days later, her first question was about her team. A chaplain sat beside her bed, and his expression told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. "Specialist Davis didn't make it," he said gently. "Sergeant Rodriguez is stable. He's asking about you." The news hit Sarah like a second explosion. Davis, with his jokes about his baby daughter and his dreams of going back to Ohio to work in his father's auto shop. Davis, who had shared his rations with local children and spent his free time writing letters to his wife. Davis, who would never meet the daughter he talked about constantly. "It should have been me," Sarah whispered, tears mixing with the bandages on her face. "No," the chaplain said firmly. "It shouldn't have been anyone. But you're alive for a reason, soldier. You saved Sergeant Rodriguez's life by keeping those fighters away from the convoy. You held that position for over an hour with a broken arm and severe injuries. That's not luck. That's courage." The physical recovery took months. Sarah was transferred to a hospital in Germany, then eventually to Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland. The surgeons did their best with her arm, but the damage was extensive. She would regain most of its function, but it would never be quite the same. The scars on her face were more visible reminders of that day, lines of raised flesh that told a story she wasn't ready to share. The emotional recovery was harder than the physical healing. Sarah found herself jumping at sudden noises, unable to sleep without medication, haunted by dreams of that October morning. The official term was post-traumatic stress disorder, but the words felt inadequate to describe the weight she carried. During her time at Walter Reed, Sarah received dozens of visitors. Rodriguez came as soon as he was able, walking with a cane, but smiling broadly when he saw her. "You saved my life," he said simply. "I owe you everything." Sarah's parents flew in from California, her mother crying when she saw the scars but trying to hide her tears behind forced smiles and cheerful conversation. Her brother Miguel, now a college freshman, sat quietly beside her bed and held her uninjured hand. "You're still my hero," he said. "These scars don't change that. They just prove it." Captain Williams visited with news from Afghanistan. The intelligence Sarah had gathered during her deployment had contributed to several successful operations. The women's groups she had worked with continued to provide information to coalition forces, and several Taliban cells had been disrupted based on leads she had developed. "Your work over there made a difference," Williams told her. "Real people are alive today because of what you did." The words helped. But they couldn't fill the hole left by Davis's death or erase the images that haunted her dreams. 8 months after the explosion, Sarah was medically retired from the Army. The ceremony was small but meaningful, attended by friends, family, and fellow soldiers who understood the price she had paid for her service. As she stood in her dress uniform for the last time, the scars on her face clearly visible despite her attempt to cover them with makeup, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and loss. That evening, she was surprised to receive a visitor she hadn't expected. Colonel Harrison stood in the doorway of her hospital room, looking older than she remembered and somehow smaller. The arrogance that had defined their previous encounter was gone, replaced by something that looked like humility. "May I come in, Martinez?" he asked. Sarah nodded, curious about what had brought him there. Harrison entered and stood awkwardly beside her bed for a moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Several apologies, actually." Sarah remained silent, waiting. "I heard about what happened in Afghanistan, about what you did during that ambush." Harrison's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "I also heard about your work with the local women, the intelligence you gathered, the lives you saved." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I was wrong about you. Completely, inexcusably wrong. You proved everything I said was based on ignorance and prejudice, not experience or wisdom." Sarah found her voice. "Why are you here, Colonel?" Harrison looked directly at her scarred face without flinching. "Because you deserved better from me. Because my job was to support you, not tear you down. Because I let my own biases cloud my judgment about one of the finest soldiers I've ever encountered." The silence stretched between them for a long moment. "Those scars," Harrison continued, gesturing toward her face. "They tell a story of courage that puts my 30 years of service to shame. You held off enemy fighters for over an hour with a broken arm and severe injuries. You saved your squad mate's life. You gathered intelligence that disrupted terrorist operations and saved countless innocent lives. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. I came here to tell you that if I had a daughter, I would want her to be exactly like you. Strong, brave, dedicated, and willing to sacrifice everything for others. The Army lost something precious when you were injured, and our country owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Harrison reached into his jacket and pulled out something small. It was a medal, the Silver Star, the military's third highest decoration for valor in combat. This was approved last week, he said, placing it on her bedside table. It recognizes your actions during the October ambush, but more than that, it recognizes what you've taught all of us about courage and sacrifice. As Colonel Harrison prepared to leave, he turned back one final time. Martinez, I hope someday you can forgive an old soldier for being too blind to see what was right in front of him. After he left, Sarah sat alone with the medal and her thoughts. The scars on her face would never fade completely, and the memories of that October day would always be with her. But for the first time since the explosion, she felt something approaching peace. She thought about Davis and the daughter he would never meet. She thought about Rodriguez and his gratitude. She thought about the Afghan women who had trusted her with their secrets and the lives that had been saved because of that trust. The scars that covered the left side of her face told a story that no words could adequately capture. They spoke of sacrifice and courage, of a young woman who had been tested in the crucible of war and had emerged as something stronger than she ever knew she could be. Years later, as Sarah worked as a counselor for other veterans struggling with the invisible wounds of war, people would sometimes stare at her scars or ask uncomfortable questions. She learned to meet their gazes directly and without shame, understanding that her scars were not symbols of weakness or victimhood, but proof of survival and service. Colonel Harrison had been wrong about many things, but he had been right about one. The scars did tell the real story, not of a soldier who had been broken by war, but of a warrior who had been forged by it into something unbreakable. Sarah Martinez had proven that courage had nothing to do with size or gender and everything to do with the willingness to stand when others fall, to fight when others flee, and to sacrifice when others take. Her scars were her medals of honor, worn proudly by a woman who had stared into the darkness of war and emerged with her humanity intact.